Hello everybody and welcome to another hobby cheating video. This one's a seminal one as we're at 200 of these. So, and for 200 I wanted to talk about something that I often get asked about, that is sort of a hot topic of discussion and something that people discover and go through. And I thought this would be a resource for people at different places in their own personal hobby journey to sort of understand what people are talking about and how they approach miniature painting and the techniques that they use to achieve a painted miniature. So this is the, for this one we're doing the guide to miniature painting techniques. So I hope you enjoy. Let's jump into it. So first off, I want to talk about the difference between technique versus style. And I'm sorry to start here, but I feel it's important to get our terminology down. So techniques, what I'm using that to mean here, and I don't want to get into a semantic discussion, so please don't actually me. But what I'm using this term as is techniques are the actual process of applying paint to the miniature. And the important part to understand is that whatever the final miniature looks like isn't necessarily influenced by this, although, you know, sometimes it certainly can be. But you can achieve the same looking miniature through almost any of these styles we're going to talk about, right? What this really is how you're using the paint, the brush, other tools, what you're doing, the order of operation, how you're doing it, at what speed, in what way, with what steps, what's your back and forth, what's your ABCDE, right? That's what I mean by technique. Style is what we actually think of when people say, like, oh, I like the style of this painter. They use a lot of different colors, or they have very high saturation within their miniatures, or things are very, sort of hyper realistic, or the heavy metal style, like how GW does. That's style. That's the final product of the technique and process. Processes are things like, I want to apply non-metallic metal. Okay, that's a process, right? That might use different techniques to achieve a different style. So let's just really muddy the waters. The important part is style is what we actually see. That is the final miniature, right? And what's notable about style is that within yourself and within the broader community, styles change. Like what's popular changes, your own personal style will change and evolve. Knowledge transfer has a big impact on style. Whereas some people keep the same technique for years and years and years and years and don't tend to alter it. But they might then, but using the same techniques, just taken to a higher level of skill, they will achieve a different style of overall painting. So, assuming I haven't completely confused you, let's get into the actual examples, because hopefully that'll make things more clear. And we're going to start, of course, our beginning point here is what I'll just call the traditional style. Again, I've labeled all these. There isn't some dictionary I'm referencing here. These are just terms that I'm going to use that I have chosen. If you find them inappropriate, again, please replace this with whatever you like. I intend no other connotations beyond what I say here on the slide or what I say out loud, okay? All right, so traditional painting method. This is your base coat, wash, and then layering on highlights. The reason I have pictures of GW paints here is because this is usually where people start. This is the first thing we often learn. The reason we learn this way is because it's easy, right? And that's not a negative. That's not a knock. That's an advantage. There is a low barrier of entry to this skill. It tends to be a very straightforward method. And so it's something that GW has built their entire paint system around. It's something that they can sell specific products toward, that people can follow exact steps that are very difficult to make mistakes with and achieve a nice looking result, right? So this is probably how we all learned. And depending on what maybe if you had an art background, you'd start differently. But for many of us, if we came into the hobby and had no art background, such as myself, this was the first way I was painting, right? And the real key with this is there's nothing innately wrong with this technique, but it has limitations. On one hand, it is a slower technique to execute often, because the style of applying a singular colored base coat and then washing and then doing lots of layers back up can often take you to a place where you're painting the same thing a lot. The other challenge with this style traditionally, or sorry, with this technique, I need to keep my own terms consistent here, I apologize, with this technique, is that it doesn't really work across all surfaces as easily, depending on your level of sort of skill and how you apply those things. So I'm sure we all had an experience early in our career where we washed something and it blew our minds because suddenly there was depth and contrast and the miniature just popped. And we were like, oh my goodness, this is great. This is amazing. I know how to paint now. And then you moved on to another miniature that had lots of like large flats, a big open, fairly flat cloak or something like that. And you did your washes, and then it just looked like junk because you had coffee staining everywhere and so on and so forth. And that's kind of the point here, is that this technique is very straightforward and will produce quite consistent results, which is certainly advantageous. But it doesn't, not every miniature is going to really react to this sort of technique in the same way. Its advantage is it's hard to screw up, in summation. Its disadvantage is that it doesn't always work, and there are some limitations as to sort of what you can ultimately do, but those limitations aren't usually quality-based because your end painting is sort of layering. So if you're willing to invest the time and cover over some of the work, you can certainly get miniatures using this kind of a technique up to an incredibly high quality. There's no question about that. All right, so most of us are probably familiar with this one. Let's keep going. All right, next up is sketch style. Sketch style is effectively something that I talk about a lot on my channel. It's something that works very well with the new contrast paints. But the core concept here is you start with something like a zenithal undershade, which if you want to see what I mean by that, I will link videos down in the description. I'm also going to mention painters here every so often of people who employ these sorts of techniques or have guides out there. So links to everything in the description, okay? So if you want to use this to branch out and see more tutorials about how to do this stuff, you can check down there. So a zenithal undershade, effectively spraying the whole model with a dark primer and then doing some lighter gray and white from above, and then using thin glazes of color or ink or shades or something over top. The handgunners you see over on the right there are a set of miniatures I did in a speed paint challenge for myself to paint 2,000 points of an army in a week, and that was done very much with this style. And it is a speed painting technique. When I think of this style, I think of Matt DiPietro. I'll link to his site down below. And he has a lot of tutorials and examples of miniatures he paints in this style. It really is a very fast and fun style that gives you quite immediate results and high contrast. As I said, this works really well with the new contrast paint. So, hey, I guess that's well aligned in terminology. The other important thing to understand here is that this is a pretty easy starting point. So what's nice about a technique like this is if you're trying to get an army on the table, you can do something like I did where you sketch style out the entire army quite quickly, and then it's painted and has contrast. But you can go back and you can build more saturation, and you can increase the saturation, you can increase the volumes at a later time through additional applications of layers or glazes or whatever you happen to want. The disadvantage here is mainly that this will result in very faded, very weak colors with very low saturation if no additional steps are taken. So if you just take a single layer of contrast paint and put it over a zenithal highlight, you will certainly have some amount of contrast. but it will be quite weak compared to when you're sort of more intensely building that up through some of these other techniques. And what will happen is your miniature will have this sort of washed out look, where the highlights aren't quite as high as they could be, and the shadows maybe aren't as dark as they could be. But overall, this is a really great technique. This is, in my mind, something that I think is a great transition point from the traditional style. It can take you to a high contrast a lot faster. I mean, it's not even close. Not even close. The fact that I was able to achieve what I was able to achieve here with the army that you see on the screen in quite literally an hour of paint, or sorry, a week of painting, maybe 40, 50, 60 hours, something like that, and get 2,000 points of painted models on the table to what I think is a perfectly acceptable quality. You wouldn't do that if I was to the same level with a traditional style. The speed isn't there. You could achieve the same look, no doubt. It just wouldn't be the same amount of time. Okay? All right. I'll link to, like I said, links to guides for Zenithal and Matt DiPietro's site in the description. Our next technique is layering, and this is often a component of many other styles, but this can be the entire method in and of itself. If you watch somebody like Dr. Faust, who is an incredibly prolific teacher and a great painter, I will link to his channel down below. I cannot believe you'd be watching this and not know who he is, but just in case, there's the link. This is usually a style that this is sort of the style he favors, amongst many other painters that are out there, by the way. The idea here is that you're starting with sort of the darkest base coat first. And instead of just washing over everything, the concept with the sort of traditional style is you're picking something in the middle, and then the wash is darker, and the layers are sort of painted over the top. The idea here is that if you were painting skin or something, you would start with the sort of darkest shadow color first, and that would be your full base coat. And then you consistently step up slightly through the integration of a lighter color. So this could be desaturation through the addition of white or ivory or something like that, but it could also just be transitioning to different hues within that same range. And you build up very slowly in thin layers. The advantage here is that you get really intense volumes as you're building toward that top layer, and your paint is very opaque once all done. That is to say, each individual layer is actually quite transparent, but when you have 10 layers on top of each other, what you get is actually a really strong opaque tone all together, right? So that's the nice advantage of this sort of a technique. It's very deliberate. It allows very precise control. So if you favor a more methodical style, this is really a great technique to follow. So the advantages is that you have very strong, opaque, saturated colors at the end of the project. Again, because each layer is quite thin and transparent, when you have 10 or 20 or 30 layers or whatever you happen to be doing, although each one is quite thin and transparent, all told, they end up being quite opaque. This is actually quite a great way to achieve smooth blends, as long as you transition slowly through thin layers. And again, if you watch Dr. Faust, you'll see a lot of this in action. This is often how he paints, and his miniatures look quite clean and smooth because he is transitioning very slowly often and really taking his time to build up the layers. The disadvantages of this are that it is quite time intensive. In fact, it can be more or less time intensive depending on the color. So that is to say, when you deal with colors that themselves are extremely transparent, say like a red, you can often find yourself needing to do a very high number of layers to get a real intense saturation or a high level of contrast and transition. Whereas if you go to more opaque colors, the disadvantage is that you may need to still do additional techniques to achieve smoothness, especially those that have more strong white or gray with the lighter colors in their range. So that is to say, if you take something like purple being the classic example, that when people mix in sort of white or gray into purple, it becomes extremely opaque very fast, and you tend to see these extremely hard transition lines between the layers, right? So it is a technique that gives you an extreme amount of control, and as long as you know how to work with it properly, when to then go back and finish, which colors are going to be more challenging, it can achieve some really, really fantastic results. If you watch a lot of Trovarian's work, and I'll link to his channel as well, this is a technique he'll often employ in his painting to sort of slowly build up very intense highlights, and he does so through these very carefully controlled layers. Sometimes they end up being more like glazes, sometimes they're more hard layers. I don't like to get caught between those two things, because who knows? They're all layers of paint. It's just a question of opacity. And you can see some of the miniatures he's worked on that I think are just absolutely stunning, and this is a technique that you can use to get to that point. All right, so again, link to both he and Dr. Faust below, who have some great examples of layering. All right, next up, value sketching. So value sketching is effectively the quick application of paint through wet blending, or wet blending layers or thicker paints, where you're trying to establish like immediate color saturation and contrast with very little blending. That is to say, like, you're not working on glazes. You're using often quite thick paints, usually straight out of the pot, wet only by like your brush being moist or something like that. Maybe whatever the wet palette gave it. And the advantage here is that it's very, very strongly and quickly establishes a lot of contrast and sets your color values. This is a really like fast and loose technique. So there are lots of people who employ this technique. This is something I do a lot. This is something famously, I think, if you've ever seen Banshee's sketches, he will often start here, because you can end up with the full range of colors that are going to appear on your miniature, but they'll often just be quite rough. And so you'll see when he paints his skin or his various things that he'll work on, Banshee will go in with these very hard, fairly opaque, thick layers of paint and just kind of set the values all over the model. And there's a lot of roughness to it, but then that can be smoothed out over time, right? The advantages here is that it establishes the full contrast range, the tones you're going to use, all the hues you're laying down, basically immediately. I mean, it takes minutes. And you immediately have this extremely broad contrast. The other fun thing is, because you're working in effectively wet paint, and so people, like I said, will either use thick paints that already have some retarder in them, so things like Scale 75 will often be used in this way. The new Pro Acryl paints are really good for this technique. Or you'll actually mix in a little retardant medium to keep the paint wet longer. This is effectively like an oil painting technique, if you think of it like that. This is often how oil paints work, because this is how 2D canvas oil artists work. Their paint stays wet, and they just keep mixing it together on the miniature. So because you're working so fast and the paint stays so wet, it's nearly impossible to make a mistake, because if something kind of is out of place, you just reblend it back into place. So it's very, very hard to screw up. The disadvantages to this one are that it requires an understanding of sort of light, shadow, and value placement. Starting from a zenithal can be quite helpful, even though you're often going to cover it up, because it can just give you a map of where you need to place lights and shadows. I do think this is a technique that I wish more was taught more to newer painters, as I say in the video where I value sketch the guy on the right. So the Esky or whatever, the demon on the right, the demon prince from the recent Slanesh range. I have a tutorial on painting in this style, and he's the miniature I painted. You know, that's him after a few minutes of work. Like, this is very, very fast, rough work. Now, of course, to get to the end of him in his final form, I had to, of course, smooth out all the colors and blends and make sure everything was placed where it should be. And that requires employing alternate methods. So the value sketch is really a technique to lay down your initial work, and then from there you go into other methods to finish. And I'll talk about that here in a moment. We're going to have a whole section on, or a slide on finishing and sort of taking models all the way up. So this is a really fun technique. I really enjoy it. It's so stress-free because you're just slapping wet paint around and doing these quick rough blends. And it really gives you a good idea of where your miniature is going to end up. Oftentimes when I'm doing this, I will just squint at the miniature and you can kind of see what it's going to look like. That's the advantage. The squinting gets rid of sort of the rough blends and stuff like that. I'll link to the video that I did about this, as well as to Banshee's Patreon, his information, because he has a lot of sort of techniques that follow on this. So if you're looking for a teacher who can really up your game with a style like this, his Patreon is a great place to look. All right, next up we need to talk about a particular tool, because it's a tool whose presence is so large that it weighs into the hobby itself and becomes almost a technique in and of itself. And that's the integration of the airbrush. For those who are just starting out on the road with an airbrush, it's probably thought of as a tool to sort of prime or establish initial base coats, and certainly that is true. If you're doing something like the traditional method, it can actually be an incredible tool to lay down your base colors a heck of a lot faster than you do with a brush. And then from there you go and do the rest of it. It can be a quick way to lay down your base layer if you're going to use a more of a layering up style, right? But that's really a limitation on the airbrush. It's such a more multifaceted tool. It can be used to establish additional layers. It can be used to glaze and finish, as we'll talk about on the next slide. So it can be used very late in the process. Somebody like Sergio Calvo is somebody who very famously uses his airbrush at the very end of the painting process and no earlier. He uses basically a layering up style to begin and then moves into his airbrush only for his final glazes. And he's very famous for this sort of style, and it's quite impressive to watch work. It really is amazing how he brings the whole miniature together at the end. I'll link out to his Patreon and his stuff as well. The advantage to the integration of the airbrush, regardless of how you're doing it, is that it increases your speed. But it can also be used to establish very strong base colors. Like, you can achieve a lot of intensity with it. You can use it to smooth out blends. You can use it to integrate very thin pop colors or filters in a way that is often very challenging with a brush, whereas with the airbrush you can very quickly and easily filter in something like an extremely thin yellow ink or something to set the tone of the light to be more warm, or a very thin blue to set the light to be more cold. So these are things that you can certainly do with a brush, but they can be a lot harder to get the exact consistency you want, or to establish your paint in the exact same way or with the exact same smoothness. And what I would impress upon people is that the airbrush is not some magical wand that you just point at the miniature and make it happen. It takes a lot of training and practice to use it in these various methods. And it's best used, I think, by those who work back and forth with it often, you know, who have integrated it in ways where it just becomes another brush. So specifically, I'd like to call out two more people here. If you're interested in upping your airbrush game, I really feel that I should direct you to Angel Giraldez, who is very famous for his airbrush work. He is a master, an absolute master with it. If you ever get a chance to take a class with him, I absolutely would recommend it. He's, obviously does a lot of incredible work on infinity miniatures and has really two great books that he's published on using the airbrush. I highly recommend both of those books. I own them and I love them. And secondly is Aaron Lovejoy, who, along with aforementioned Matt DiPietro and Elizabeth Beckley Bradford, have a group called Miniature Monthly, which I would also recommend you go check out. And then finally, of course, I should mention that I am part of a studio called CK Studios, and that as a studio, we integrate the airbrush quite heavily into our work. You can find all of the classes I and the other instructors teach down in the description of all of my videos. And of course, the head of our studio, which is Caleb Wissenbach, is one of the great wizards of the airbrush, and he teaches several different classes along with the rest of the instructors, but he has from very beginners in teaching you how to utilize the tool, so if you just got it, all the way up. This isn't really about spruiking anything in particular, but it's a tool that I think often confounds people, and there's a lot of great learning out there. So I would say if you're interested, please do check out any of those links, whether my studio or others, because it really is a very versatile tool and can be integrated in a lot of different ways. The disadvantages are fairly obvious. It requires an airbrush. That is an investment of money and time to learn how to do with it, and it's a fairly orthogonal skill to traditional brush painting. But it's a worthwhile pursuit, as anything in this hobby usually is. And it does require a lot of practice and extreme control for sort of the final glazing or smoothing techniques or those later integration steps beyond priming and base coating. But again, it's one of those things that I find very worth it. So finally, I want to talk about glazing and finishing. In all the techniques we've talked about so far, there's usually going to be some final steps that require what I'll call glazing and finishing. And that is to say, if you're trying to achieve something like what you see over here on the right, which is the Lord Celestins painted by Darren Latham, who is one of the sculptors for Games Workshop, former heavy metal painter for many years, and an absolute artist. I've reviewed some of his miniatures before. But the key with something like this is that he didn't get to what this is through the use of any one of the techniques or paths that we've already talked about, right? He used various techniques, but then at the end, there is a glazing and finishing step. And I think this is the thing that's the most challenging as you're learning, as you're finding your own techniques, as you're learning the various techniques, and as you're moving through things. Because this is where it requires the most control, the most understanding of how your paints are going to respond, your brushes are going to respond, and all of this sort of thing. He has a tutorial on this sort of non-metallic metal that I will link you to on his blog, which, by the way, is absolutely wonderful. And he talks about how a lot of the work here is through and he has sort of step-by-step pictures of a couple different examples of non-metallic metal. But he talks about how these very careful, very controlled, very thin glazes of red and yellow, specifically I believe he was using the old bloodletter glaze and the, what was it? Lamenter's yellow. That's what it was, sorry. To sort of add the richness to the tones of this non-metallic metal. This is usually the most time-intensive step, and is usually the difference that takes a miniature up to a very high level. The disadvantage is, of course, it requires a great amount of time, not just skill, which, of course, is sort of prima facie obvious, but it also requires a great amount of time to the point where I'll say that moving through the techniques that you saw on the, on the slides we've talked about thus far is maybe at most 40% of my miniature painting time, maybe 50 or 60 on some faster projects. But when I'm taking something to a display or especially a competition level, this is where the majority of my time is in this glazing and finishing, where I'm very carefully adjusting colors, increasing saturation, adding pop colors, changing and adding filters, smoothing transitions, just all of this work that goes into the littlest details, right? And these are sorts of the final steps. And again, this can be brush or, as we mentioned on the previous slide, an airbrush, although some spaces are going to kind of often be small enough that you're going to need to use the brush no matter how sharp you are with the airbrush. But the important part to understand about all of the techniques I've discussed for getting going with painting the miniature is that these kinds of final steps, like glazing and like these various filters and things like that, are going to be sort of the most challenging aspect of the overall painting process. Again, sure, are there processes that are very difficult to learn, like this non-metallic metal? Absolutely, right? But when you're, I think, just learning, this is an area where I would focus a lot on this initial brush control, on understanding how your paint reacts to being thinned, on understanding how to control the amount of paint coming off your brush onto the miniature. These are the things, the sort of base and foundational skills that will really help you achieve not only faster results in the long run, but higher quality results in the long run. Because once you have a more intimate understanding of your tools and your paints in these kinds of steps, you will tend to achieve a higher level or a higher looking, higher quality, whatever we want to say, miniature. Okay? So, that's glazing and finishing. Again, links to, I have a video on how to glaze and adding these kinds of techniques. So if you're curious about it or you want some work, you want some practice or to see it in practice, that link is down below, as well as Darren's blog. Go check it out. It's very worth it. So that brings us through all of the miniature painting techniques that sort of I think of as the major techniques. None of these are as siloed as I described them. The reality is that these can often intermix, get up at all in each other's business, right? Miniature painting techniques are really a soup, and lots of painters will go back and forth, employ different parts of these techniques or different elements of these techniques for different areas of the miniature or when they're doing different projects. There really isn't one technique that is highly superior to the other. It's about a technique that works better for what you are trying to achieve at that moment, the amount of time you have to paint, the end result you are aiming at, and the level of skill or the place on your hobby journey that you happen to be. But I would encourage you to sort of experiment with all of these techniques that I've talked about, to check out the links down below, to see some of these in practice, because I do believe that, especially if you're at an earlier point in your journey, that understanding the fundamentals of what these different techniques can achieve is highly valuable to eventually developing your own personal, sense of how you paint a miniature, your own personal path, the steps, the ABC that you follow that achieves the results you would like. So, with that being said, that's techniques. In a future video, I'm going to cover styles. And styles is the output, that kind of thing. So, we'll come back to that. I promise it won't be tutorial 300. It'll be before that. But as always, I do very much hope that this was helpful. If you've got additional thoughts on techniques, if you feel I missed anything absolutely critical, like I said, there are certainly others out there. I just tried to really hit the sort of major ones, as it were, as much as I could bucket things that are more soupy than individually solid. But if you have other comments, please drop it down below. If you have questions on any of these, of course, feel free to ask. But don't forget to give that a like. Subscribe for additional hobby cheating in the future. If you have something you'd like to see in a future video, feel free to comment down below. But as always, I do very much appreciate you watching this one, and we'll see you next time.